In 1937, an Italian mobster made one mistake that would cost him everything. He called Bumpy Johnson a slur. 7 days later, the Italian Mafia learned a lesson that would rewrite the rules of power in New York forever. This is the true story of the humiliation that sparked a silent war, the revenge that shook the underworld, and the night Little Italy learned Harlem was not for sale. The story begins in July of 1937, in a cramped back room above a dark trattoria on Mulberry Street, where cigarette smoke hung so thick it felt like fog, and the smell of garlic and cheap Chianti mixed with sweat and ambition. The most feared Italian mob families had gathered to discuss business expansion into Harlem's policy rackets. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an announcement disguised as hospitality. Bumpy Johnson arrived with two quiet men who sat behind him and said nothing. The Italians barely acknowledged him. They spoke rapidly in Sicilian, laughed loudly, poured wine, and toasted to future profits, acting as if the man sitting across from them wasn't the most respected figure in Harlem's black underground. At one point, Don Salvatore Bellini, the aging patriarch with cold eyes and manicured fingers, tapped his spoon against a glass for silence, and finally addressed Bumpy. "Business is moving north," he said, "and we figured you'd rather be a friend than a problem." The room chuckled, but Bumpy didn't. His expression was unreadable. He had come for respect, not approval. That was when the real mistake happened. Rocco Bellini, the Don's youngest son, drunk on wine and power he hadn't earned, leaned back in his chair. Churton pointed his glass at Bumpy and said with a smirk loud enough for every boss in the room to hear, "Tell the boy we're doing him a favor." The word boy carried more venom than the slur that followed, a word soaked in the same hatred Dutch Schultz once used, a word designed to humiliate. The room exploded with laughter. Men slapped the table, someone whistled. Bumpy didn't blink. He didn't respond. He didn't get angry. He simply stood up, adjusted his coat, and said quietly, "Harlem speaks for itself." Then he walked out. The laughter continued behind him, but every man at that table would remember that moment for the rest of his life. Bumpy didn't ride back to Harlem in silence. His two men argued in the back seat. One demanded immediate retaliation, a firefight on Mulberry Street, bodies on sidewalks, pistol smoke in the summer air. The other warned that the Italians had bigger numbers, better firepower, and political coverage from judges and police that Harlem's underworld could never match. Bumpy remained silent, staring out the window as Chinatown blurred past, then the Bowery, then the long stretch toward 125th Street. He wasn't thinking about the insult. He was thinking about the consequences. The next morning, Harlem learned what had happened faster than the newspapers could print yesterday's headlines. Policy runners whispered about it before noon. Barbershops discussed it in the evening. By midnight, kids were repeating it on sidewalks, not fully understanding the gravity, but feeling the heat anyway. Some of Bumpy's allies expected him to strike immediately, but he didn't. He spent 3 days doing the one thing every successful gangster must master. He listened. He listened to Harlem's anger. He listened to its fear. He listened to the resentment boiling beneath the surface every time outsiders showed up to take money from black neighborhoods without offering dignity in return. Bumpy wasn't planning revenge. He was weighing responsibility. When outsiders humiliate you, the city watches how you respond. If you bow your head, you lose more than money. You lose the right to lead. That understanding had carried him through the Dutch-Schultz War 2 years earlier, and it would guide him now. The insult wasn't about ego. It was about survival. To understand why the Italians misplayed Harlem so badly, you have to understand the Bellini family. Don Salvatore Bellini was an old-world Sicilian, states a man who believed power lived in two places: the fear in a man's eyes and the envelope in a judge's pocket. He wasn't stupid, just blind to realities outside his world. He saw Harlem as a revenue stream, a piece of territory full of gamblers and policy players waiting to be taxed. His son Rocco, on the other hand, had none of his father's patience and twice his arrogance. Born in New York, raised on stories of Mussolini and Mafia glory, he grew up believing Italians owned the city and everyone else existed to work beneath them. That arrogance created the perfect storm because Rocco didn't understand that Harlem wasn't just geography, it was identity. Italians controlled docks, labor unions, produce markets, garment trucks, and liquor warehouses. Harlem controlled itself, and in Harlem, Bumpy was more than a policy banker. He was a gatekeeper. He'd been watching the Bellinis for months before the Mulberry Street insult. He knew who collected their money, who delivered their envelopes to station houses, who transported their policy slips from East Harlem to Brooklyn, who ordered beatings, and who cleaned up afterward. He knew the weak points that came with privilege. Protected men get lazy, protected men get visible. Protected men travel the same routes every day because they believe nobody is stupid enough to attack them. Bumpy took notes. Rocco took victory laps. Only one of them understood what the city was becoming. Harlem responded before Bumpy issued a single order. Policy players stopped cooperating with Italian collectors. Old women refused to open their doors. Men on stoops stared but didn't speak. And nothing scares an outsider more than silence. The Bellinis tried intimidation. They sent muscle into Harlem bars, leaned on bartenders, threatened barbers, slapped around teenagers running slips. But intimidation only works when the community feels alone. Harlem didn't. Harlem had Bumpy, and Harlem remembered Dutch Schultz. The white newspapers didn't print that version, of course. They wrote about minor disturbances and union-related tensions. They never printed the slurs. They never mentioned the humiliation. They never explained that violence was a language with dialects, and Harlem spoke a different one than Little Italy. While the presses lied, the streets told the truth. Italians were losing money in a neighborhood they thought they already owned. Bumpy, meanwhile, never appeared in public. Not because he was hiding, but because he was studying. Through he learned which Bellini couriers carried cash, which capos traveled with minimal protection, which policemen had been bought, which judges were friendly, and which warehouse foremen handled policy ledgers before burning the rejects in oil drums behind Pier 45. When his lieutenants asked if they should start killing, Bumpy shook his head. "Killing the wrong man starts the wrong war," he said. "A war you cannot win is not a war. It is suicide." The first public blow didn't come in Harlem. It came in the Bronx, late on a Wednesday night. When a Bellini policy collector named D'Angelo Cruz climbed into his Ford sedan with 2 money bags and drove toward Mott Haven to hand off the night's collections. He never saw the men following him. They boxed him in at a red light, yanked him from the car, tied his hands, and shoved him into the trunk. But they didn't kill him. Instead, they drove him to a quiet alley, beat him just enough to humble him, then pinned a note to his jacket before leaving him on the sidewalk to be found by early morning fruit vendors. The note said only 3 words: "Respect is mandatory." When news reached Mulberry Street, Rocco exploded. He demanded retaliation, demanded bodies, demanded a message that would teach Harlem what Italian steel felt like. Don Salvatore refused. He understood something Rocco didn't. Bumpy was probing, not attacking, and probing is always a warning. The Italians called Bumpy a boy because they assumed black criminals were gangs, not organizations. They assumed Harlem was disorganized, emotional, and reactive. They assumed Bumpy would show up with guns like a child picking a fight on a playground. Instead, he brought a strategy. Nothing terrifies a big crew more than a small crew that plans. Bumpy called his inner circle together in a basement on 139th Street, the same basement where he had once planned against Schultz. He wrote 7 names on a sheet of paper. Not bosses, not high-ranking capos, infrastructure. The men who kept the Bellini machine alive, a union payoff courier who delivered envelopes to politicians every Thursday, a numbers bank auditor who verified profits for the month, a warehouse foreman who sorted policy slips before burning them, a doorman at the illegal casino front who controlled who entered and who exited, a police sergeant who ensured certain cases disappeared before arraignment, a loan shark who extorted small business owners for interest, and last on the list, Rocco Bellini. Bumpy slid the list across the table. There was no dramatic speech, no chest thumping. Just a sentence said quietly, "Without these men, the Bellinis cannot breathe." His lieutenant asked what the timetable was, and Bumpy responded with 3 words Harlem would remember for decades. 7 days, clean. Clean did not mean nonviolent. Clean meant controlled. No civilians, no Harlem collateral, no chaos. Chaos makes enemies. Precision makes statements. Day 1 hit like a whisper. The payoff courier vanished, leaving a trail of envelopes scattered like frightened birds in the alley. Day 2, the numbers auditor was found locked in his own office vault, bruised but breathing, ledger missing. Day 3, trucks burned silently on Pier 45, while the warehouse foreman lay zip-tied to a fence post with a broken hand. The newspapers wrote about accidents and union sabotage. The politicians panicked because envelopes stopped arriving. Italian bosses panicked because profits stopped moving. Rocco panicked because panic is the only language he understood. His father watched it all with the expression of a man who finally realized he had underestimated a variable he never accounted for: a black organization with discipline. On the 6th night, the Bellinis sent a quiet request through intermediaries. They wanted a meeting, neutral ground, no guns, no insults, no theater. Bumpy agreed, not for peace, for clarity. The dinner took place in a midtown restaurant above 47th Street, far from Harlem, far from Mulberry, far from judges and precinct captains who might overhear things better, left unrecorded. Don Salvatore arrived with one advisor. Bumpy arrived alone. They sat across from each other like 2 men playing chess with real consequences. Don Salvatore apologized, but only for disrespect, not for racism. Old world men apologize for injury, not ideology. He offered concessions: shared revenue in Harlem, mutual protection pacts, agreements about territories and alliances. Bumpy listened without expression, then asked only one question: "Where is your son?" Don Salvatore didn't answer immediately because he couldn't. Rocco had not been seen since the afternoon. His father suspected why, but couldn't admit it. Silence confirmed everything. Rocco's body was discovered at dawn in East Harlem, near the same sidewalk his bodyguards had once mocked for being colored territory. He had not been tortured. He had not been mutilated. He had simply been executed with a single bullet behind the ear, the mark of a professional who respects efficiency. Pinned to his shirt was a note that read only, "Respect Harlem. Respect our people." Don Salvatore received the message through a lawyer. He didn't retaliate. He didn't send soldiers. He didn't declare war. He pulled his entire operation out of Harlem quietly over the next 2 weeks. No headlines recorded the retreat. No newsreel cameras covered the departure. But the underworld noticed. Italians stopped calling black gangsters boys. They stopped assuming Harlem was property. They stopped assuming that white privilege guaranteed victory. A new rule had been written into New York's criminal code. A rule without ink or signatures. Respect is not generosity, it is currency. And anyone who refuses to pay it will bleed. The legacy was not that Bumpy Johnson won a turf dispute. The legacy was that he changed the terms under which men conducted business across racial lines. From that day forward, Italians stayed downtown, Harlem stayed Harlem, and the city learned that humiliation has a cost measured not in pride, but in bodies. Outsiders would call it mob violence. Harlem called it balance. And for the first time in New York's criminal history, white gangsters looked north and understood something simple and permanent. Harlem was not for sale.